General Erwin Rommel was famous for his daring and brilliant battlefield leadership, but his adventurous style brought with it many dangers and brushes with death. In the deserts of North Africa, he would push his luck to the extreme, and his enemies would shake their heads in dismay as the desert fox gambled time and again and showed that fortune sometimes favors the brave. Rommel was an experienced pilot and always keen to practice his skills. In North Africa, he took full advantage of the bright weather and wide-open landscape to fly his Fiesler Stork spotter plane. From his Stork, he could perform reconnaissance, observe battles, and issue commands via radio to the troops on the ground. During a return trip from the front on the 28th of February 1941, the Stork suffered sudden engine failure. The plane began losing altitude while Rommel wrestled with the controls. As Tripoli came into sight, he steered the Stork for a rough landing on the desert floor, large stones ripping open the underside of the plane. Despite the ordeal, Rommel was uninjured and airborne again just a few days later. On the 31st of March, he took to the skies again with an Africa Corps lieutenant to visit the front lines. With the sun low in the sky, a vicious sandstorm emerged across the horizon. Unable to outrun it, he dropped altitude to try and fly under the worst of the dust clouds. Almost hugging the desert floor, Rommel, perhaps obeying his instincts, suddenly pulled the nose up. Just as well, for the dust had concealed an enormous sand dune. The Stork missed the dune by inches. The lieutenant, shaken up by the experience, opted to travel by truck for the return journey. On the 20th of April 1941, just outside the port city of Tobruk, a convoy of German vehicles carrying the Desert Fox and his staff was strafed by a daring British fighter. The Englishman targeted the car he believed might be carrying the higher-ranking Germans. His guess was correct. Rommel's car was ravaged by bullets as the Hurricane fighter tore past at low altitude. The car's driver plus one clerk were killed, and a third wounded. Miraculously, all the bullets had missed Rommel. The stories of his close calls were now spreading throughout the ranks, and while his officers pleaded with him to stay away from the front lines, the soldiers at the front were only further inspired by his apparent contempt for fate. His reputation was soaring. When the Germans attempted again to capture Tobruk, Rommel took to the skies in his Stork to observe the rolling battles across the desert. As he strayed too low, he began to take rifle fire from British troops. Banking away towards Axis lines, he was not amused to find his Italian allies also firing at him. Apparently, the Italian infantry didn't recognize the Stork. Owing to their poor aim, a major disaster was narrowly averted. The British troops, however, had turned the plane's wings into Swiss cheese. An unharmed Desert Fox continued on unfazed, though, and his reputation continued to grow. But by August of that year, the harsh desert and constant stress of battle had taken its toll on the general's health. On the 5th, he suffered a heart attack and was flown to Austria for treatment. Weak and fatigued, he nevertheless continued making plans for future engagements in North Africa. Against his doctor's wishes, he flew back to the desert less than a week later. On the morning of the 10th of August, Rommel and his staff arrived by Juncker's transport plane in Bardia, Libya. Immediately after disembarking, the Junkers took off for its return flight. Just minutes after takeoff, the Junkers suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure and fell from the sky like a lead weight. The general and his staff watched on in horror as the plane crashed into the desert, taking the whole crew with it. Once again, the fox had evaded death. Several months later, the Germans were once again embroiled in fierce combat at the gates of Tobruk. During the hectic and often confusing battles along the Gazala line, an English spotter plane located Rommel's staff convoy, set up as a temporary command post between several dunes. The British zeroed in their artillery and began shelling the encampment. The adjutants and clerks, many of whom were very green, panicked and fled into the dunes to escape the shelling. Rommel and his personal clerk, Rolf Muninger, took cover beneath his command truck. Rolf, alarmed by the sight, alerted him to his fleeing staff. Rommel, without even looking up from his map, responded, "Don't worry, they'll be back." After the shelling passed, Rolf was once more alarmed to see a 3-inch piece of shrapnel lodged in Rommel's boot heel. He couldn't hide his astonishment at the razor-thin margins by which his general continued to spite fate. There were many more narrow escapes for the Desert Fox during his campaigns in North Africa, each one making his star even brighter on the world stage. Nobody could deny his bravery, and nobody could deny his was a fox with 9 lives.
Ihr Adligen Heid